Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harn Museum. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dulce Román. I'm Chief Curator at the Harn, and I'm also the Curator of Modern Art. And right now we are in SFI Gallery, also known as the Modern Gallery. And I'm going to discuss some of the recent works that we just installed a couple weeks ago in this space, the center of the Modern Gallery, which is dedicated to works on paper. The modern collection includes about 2,200 plus works of art. They include paintings, sculpture, art glass, and what I call works on paper, but of course that describes a lot of different media on paper, such as watercolors, drawings, and prints. And the collection has a strong representation of art of the United States, but we also have some incredible works by European artists, like this gorgeous landscape by Claude Monet, which is in another section of the gallery, and also some works by Latin American artists, which are just behind you. We have 3 examples right there. And our collection of art glass is at the entrance to this space and is in some beautiful custom display cases. So this is just one of 5 main collecting areas at the Harn. Our other main collecting areas also include African art and Asian art, photography, which is in an adjacent gallery, and contemporary art. And a lot of people do confuse modern and contemporary arts. I just wanted to explain that the modern collection includes art from the late 19th century through the mid 20th century, while the contemporary collection begins around 1945, so just after World War II. And that collection is in another gallery. It has its own large space that you can access nearby if you go around this way. Modern art, as I said, is related to a specific time period. It's not a specific style or a specific movement. Modern art is late 19th century through mid 20th century, and it encompasses a lot of the isms. A lot of the isms you've heard, like cubism, futurism, expressionism, precisionism, fauvism, also social realism, and American scene painting. So it's not a specific style, but more related to a specific time period. The modern gallery that we're in now is organized around loose themes. We have a section on landscapes, a section on urban scenes, still life. There are also beautiful figural studies in painting and sculpture. And then, as I mentioned, the art glass. And then in the center of the gallery where we are right now, this space is dedicated just to works on paper because it gives us a specific area to bring in a grouping around a specific theme and to keep them in this area together. And then we change this space out sometimes every 6 months, sometimes we wait a whole year. The earliest works that we have in this grouping right now that we're looking at are 2 small crayon drawings by Oscar Bluemner, and also this watercolor by Charles Birchfield. And then the latest works in this section are a watercolor by Lionel Feininger, and also this watercolor by Reginald Marsh. And then so we have the 19 teens all the way to the early 1930s in this section. And today I would like to focus on just 4 of those works to give you some background on the artists, on their careers, some information on the themes that they chose, and also to take a closer look at how they approached their subjects. So I want to start with this watercolor by Charles Birchfield. It's called Long Summer Evening, and it dates to 1916. And as I mentioned, the medium is watercolor, and that was what Birchfield was most well known for his watercolors. He also worked not just in watercolor, but sometimes those pieces combine other mediums. For example, gouache. This one includes also pencil, and he also worked with crayon and pastel. Birchfield grew up in Salem, Ohio. He was from a small community. One interesting fact that I came across when I was reading about him recently is that he was his high school class valedictorian in 1911. And then he went on to attend art school at the Cleveland School of Art in Cleveland for 4 years, from 1912 to 1916. And when he graduated in May of 1916, he returned to his hometown. He went back to Salem, Ohio, and he worked at the Mullins Company. I had never heard of this company. I looked them up. They were a metalworking company. They provided materials for a lot of different industries, and of course the automobile industry, which was very new at that time period, right? We're talking about 1916. So Charles Birchfield worked filing some of the automobile parts. For example, they worked on, they produced brake drums, housing covers, radiator shells, fender irons, gear housing plates, and wheel discs, and other materials related to the automobile industry. But remember, he had just spent 4 years studying art at a professional art school. He's a professional artist, but he was trying to get his career started. And he was working at this company, but during his lunch breaks, he would go out and continue sketching and painting. Well, eventually, no, he didn't design cars. He didn't design cars. Long Summer Evening dates to the summer of 1916. So it's right after he finished his studies at the Cleveland Art School. So he's working at the Mullins Company, filing auto parts, but he's also working on his art when he has time off. And it's signed and dated here, Birchfield, 1916. In the 1920s, he got a better job that was more related to his training. He worked as a designer in a wallpaper company in Buffalo. But by 1929, he had representation by an art dealer in New York City, the Wren Galleries, R-E-H-N, and he was able to resign from his job designing wallpaper. His early works, 1916 to 1918, that time period, a lot of his watercolors show scenes, landscapes around his hometown where he was living, Salem, Ohio. And he also was developing a very personal language. He was approaching landscape with a very personal visual language. There, he was translating or addressing natural elements with very stylized forms, very fanciful. You don't see that as much here, although there's a bit of abstraction here, but it's his later work that soon after this time period where it becomes even more fanciful and imaginative. So here we have a lush, verdant landscape. We see some houses here in the foreground. Also, most of the composition is comprised of the sky. I wanted to mention that in 1930, the Museum of Modern Art, which had just opened, it opened in November 1929, they organized an exhibition of his early watercolors, works from this time period, just from 1916 to 1918. So his watercolors from a 2-year period were exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in 1930. And in the catalog, there was an interesting commentary on his watercolors of that time period. And mind you, this was the first single artist exhibition that the Museum of Modern Art had organized. And who did they choose but Charles Birchfield? So it really tells you how far his career, his trajectory had progressed by that time period. So in the catalog, it says, quote, during this early romantic period, so imagine, this is 1930 a critic reflecting on his earlier work. During this early romantic period, Birchfield concentrated upon the expression of moods and emotions on the one hand, and on the other upon specific forces and even sounds and movements of nature. And I think this really reflects his approach to this landscape, this particular landscape. So we have long summer evening. We know the subject. We know the time of day. And we know a little bit about his background and what his interests were during this time period: nature, stylized nature, approaching nature from an eye of abstraction. So in this picture, for example, we have a very stylized approach to the depiction of the clouds. They're very angular drawings. So if you look up close, you'll see that the composition started as a drawing in pencil or graphite. So you can see the outline of the clouds and the formations and the landscape in general. And then over that, he created with the watercolor, the forms, the depth, the suggestion of direction of light. And in the sky, we have the transition from the sunset, the yellows of sunset to the darkening sky. So we have the progression of the colors of the sky changing from lower all the way up and getting darker and darker as you go up into the composition. So we have abstracted, distorted forms, subtle range of colors in the sky, and all of that is reflecting his emotional response to the subject and his connection to his hometown landscape. The next one I'd like to talk about is this watercolor by John Marin. So this is another contemporary. The four artists I'd like to talk about, Birchfield, Marin, Dickinson, and Marsh, they're all contemporaries. They're all born in the late 19th century. So John Marin, a contemporary of Birchfield, who we were just looking at, he's also known mostly for his watercolors, but he was also a very accomplished painter in oils and a printmaker. He grew up in Weehawken, New Jersey. That is just across New York City, across the Hudson or the Hudson River, sorry. He also, like Birchfield, initiated his career in a different area. So Birchfield was starting out as a designer of wallpaper, and Marin started out as an architect. And he worked in that field for 6 years before he decided at the age of 28 that he wanted to be a professional artist. So he went on to study at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and also at the Art Students League in New York City. And then he went to Europe. That was very common in the day for artists after they had studied formally to go to Europe to continue their education by looking at the great masters of art history. So he went to Europe for 5 years. He was there from 1905 until 1909, and he was exposed to avant-garde styles in Europe, Cubism, Futurism, and other styles. And then when he returned to New York, he became a member of an avant-garde circle of artists who were working in New York City around the circle of Alfred Stieglitz, who was a famous photographer, and he was a promoter of modern art, and he had his own gallery in New York City. So Marin was also one of the first American artists who was featured in a single artist exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, like Birchfield. An exhibition on his work was at MoMA in 1936. As a watercolorist, you can see by looking here, he has a very broad fluid style. He does start the composition with, looks like charcoal, although it's not listed here, it could be crayon. And then he builds the landscape over that with watercolor. And the title is Tidal Falls, Deer Isle, Rustling Brook. And he created this piece in 1923, and he did sign it here, Marin 23. So the scene depicts Deer Isle, that's referenced in the title, and that is a remote community on the Maine coast. And this was a place that he was visiting many, many, many times. He first visited in 1914, and he made visits there every year. And he became, actually, he also bought a small island off of Small Point. So it became a lifelong place that he would go. And he was fascinated with the coastline there, with the granite cliffs you can see articulated here, the spruce trees, the forests, this rustling brook, so the water, the ocean, the coastline, all of those things became really popular subjects for him at the time. So as I mentioned, he started this with drawing, crayon, or charcoal. We have the undulating lines that form the main structures of the composition, then laying over that the watercolors for the colors, the depth, lighting. He also tilted the plane so that we have an extremely high horizon line up here. So mostly what you see is this focus in view of the landscape and a de-emphasis of the sky and the space beyond. Also, he has added this frame that he drew around the composition. In sections, it's open, and in sections, the watercolor or the composition actually goes over and outside that line. These factors have been interpreted as showing the dynamic tension that he saw in his subjects in the landscape. So his imagery is directly related to nature, but yet he's seeking to capture a spirit or an emotion in his composition. And this piece I'm not going to talk much about, but this is John Marin's boat, 1917, so it's a little earlier, but you can see him also experimenting with abstraction here, but taking it even further, pushing the limits of abstraction even further to an image that if you didn't know that the title was boat, you may not recognize it as a boat. And I'd like to move on to two works on this wall over here. This work by Preston Dickinson, another contemporary of the artist we've been looking at, is called Grain Elevators, and it's dated to 1924. This is not a watercolor. It is crayon, chalk, and colored pencil on paper, and it dates to 1924. Dickinson grew up in New York City. He studied art at the Art Students League, and then, as Marin did, he went to Europe. He traveled in 1911, he studied in Paris, and he returned to New York in 1914, right at the outbreak of World War I. And he began painting realistic scenes around New York, around Manhattan. But by the 1920s, he was pushing even further the limits of abstraction and became interested in a geometric reduction that was associated with the precisionist movement. And that was not an actual group per se, but it was a term that was created by art critics to describe a loose-knit group of artists who were painting what was, they were painting industrial landscapes and urban scenes, but they were using a very precise, simplified representation, reducing their subject matter to basic geometric forms. Another artist in that group is Charles Sheeler. You may have heard of him. He was an artist as well as a photographer. So he sketched grain elevators. The site is in Omaha, Nebraska, and he created at least 10 variations on this theme. So we see very simplified pictorial elements. He's reduced the grain elevator and the associated buildings to their most basic elements. There's an emphasis on the verticality, the flatness of forms, where he has added color to accentuate and articulate the forms of the grain elevators. He hardly ever inscribed his drawings, but this one, if you look closely later, you'll see it's inscribed in the lower left. It says to Oronzo from, what does it say? From Preston, to Oronzo from Preston. The person he's referencing is Oronzo Vito Gasparo, who was a fellow artist. They were good friends, and they traveled together in 1930, so years after this was created. They traveled together to France and Spain. They wanted to make a living there, and they planned on staying for a long time. But unfortunately, later that year, Dickinson died of pneumonia while he was in Spain. So the fourth work, and the last one I want to talk about, is by Reginald Marsh. It's called Industrial Landscape with Railroad Cars. So you do see a relationship in style to the Preston Dickinson, which I think explains why I decided to put them here on this wall. When I started planning this installation, I wanted to select works that we hadn't shown in a long time. And these are some of my favorites that I was reserving for a future exhibition, didn't quite know when I would have an opportunity to show them. I selected them first and then decided what would be the layout, how would I group them? And then I was scratching my head to try and figure out, well, how do I organize this space? And I decided, well, we'll put the pictures that are more related to natural elements, looking at nature together over here, and then we'll put the industrial works over here. And then I put all of these on this side, which mostly are urban themes, but I think we also have more of a suburban kind of theme on the two works by Oscar Bluemner. But back to Reginald Marsh. So Industrial Landscape with Railroad Cars. This is one of the later works in this grouping. It dates to 1930. Marsh was primarily known for his depictions of New York City. His favorite themes were the New York City skyline, the Bowery, vaudeville, subways, railroad cars. Did I mention Coney Island? So he's known as a chronicler of New York City in the 1930s and 40s. He was born in Paris. So he is an American artist, but he was born in Paris. His parents were American, and his parents were they were professional artists, but they were independently wealthy. So they had traveled to Europe, and that's where their son was born. So his parents' names were Fred Dana and Alice Marsh. They came back to the United States in 1900 when Marsh was only 2 years old, and he grew up in New York City. He attended Yale University, and he started his career as an artist while he was a student at Yale. He was a cartoonist for the Yale newspaper called the Yale Record, the school newspaper. After graduation, he moved to New York City, and he became a staff artist for various New York City publications. So for example, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and the New York Daily News. And then in 1925, he traveled to Europe, and he wanted to study the old masters. So he wanted to study artists like Peter Paul Rubens, Rembrandt, so artists of the Northern Baroque period. He was fascinated with how they were able to capture scenes with many figures in a theatrical environment, and how they were able to articulate three-dimensional space with using all those figures and human bodies. So a lot of his watercolors, you can see that interest and influence in large groups of figures. But he also, as I said, was a chronicler of the city and of architecture around New York City. When he came back to the United States, he studied at the Art Students League, and he started to paint scenes around New York City. In this one, we have some of his favorite themes. So locomotives, like this large train in the foreground, bridges you see in the background, and then the overall industrial landscape. So we have him addressing the grime, the grit of the city through the large smokestacks of the factory, and also by the train, and also the palette, the colors he's using, the browns, the shades of browns and grays and blacks, referencing the city and the seedier side of city. So his works don't necessarily convey all the beautiful things in New York, but he's interested in the grit and the grime of the city. So I mentioned that this section is addressing works on paper, and it does change out. Sometimes it's on a 6-month rotation, sometimes it's a full year. And the reason that the works on paper are grouped in the center of the gallery like this is we were looking for a space where, when we did a grouping of work on paper, it wouldn't impact the entire gallery and create a domino effect where the works on paper, because they have specific requirements, wouldn't necessitate moving the paintings around as well. So what do I mean by specific requirements? Well, I don't know if you can tell, but this section of the gallery is lit much dimmer, much more dimly than the other parts of the space. And that's because works on paper are more susceptible to damage over time if they're exposed to light. And we don't have any direct light from windows here, but even the lights overhead in the museum, and even with, say, UV protection, they're still susceptible to fading over time. And so we want to protect them, and that's why we use lighter, dimmer lighting when we're displaying works on paper. So you'll see how bright the light is over there. That's more like, say, 26 to 30, what we call foot candles. And then this area is closer to 8 to 10 foot candles. And another restriction we have on work on paper in the museum, and all museums, we limit how long we'll display the works on paper to get a handle on how much exposure they're getting. So we have a limit to 12 months within a 5-year period. So within every 5-year period, we can only show a specific work on paper, whether it's a print, a drawing, a watercolor, a pastel. We can only show them for 12 months within a 5-year period. And it's nice to not use all that up at one time, which is why I do prefer to change this space every 6 months, because then I have another 6 months left for that specific piece. So what do you see in here over time? Well, previous installations in this area have included groupings of artists who were working together or worked on a particular theme that was related. Like right now, it's landscapes and urbanscapes. We've also had groups of artists, for example, women artists or Latin American artists, or artists working together in a specific studio, like the Works Progress Administration artists who worked in the New York City workshop during the Depression and were funded by the New Deal projects. We've also had themes that dealt with the circus, fun things like that. I did one that was on fantasy and dreams. There could be literary references. We've done one that was on botanical studies. So there are so many. I think I mentioned that out of the 22 or so hundred pieces in the modern collection, about half of them are works on paper. So there's a lot of material to draw from to create small installations in this space. And sometimes we've also borrowed work from local private collections. And I also have thoroughly enjoyed working with students, University of Florida students, who have co-curated this section with me after working with them, say, over a whole semester, where they've created a theme and a checklist and contributed to some of the research and the writing. So I don't know what the next theme will be. These just were installed a couple weeks ago. I still have to decide strategically if I'm going to keep them up for 6 months or a year, and then what that next theme is going to be. So that is my overview, and I invite questions or even suggestions of what themes you'd like to see in this space. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Well, the limit to 12 months every 5 years actually applies to the entire collection of the museum, all the collections, not just the modern. So those Ethiopian pieces, I think Speechless is up for at least 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. So that is all tracked by our registration department in our database, so that if a curator wants to know if something's available, we can look in the database to see how much display time it has left. Absolutely, because you need to see what's available to figure out what complementary works you can build a theme around. Absolutely.
Thank you. Since these plants are going to grow indoors in space, we're proving different types of light treatments. I am I am not sure if it's possible to prove or research about different light treatments for these paper works.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are experimenting with different things. In this case, you will notice a strip of paper that has different shades of blue on it. That's one way we're tracking how quickly and how much do those colors fade or change over time that they've been displayed in this gallery. That will give us information on how some of the papers and some of the works on paper will react over time. So we're testing through strips like that in some of the other galleries as well. We're also considering having some of our galleries have lights that will come on when someone enters the room but remain dark afterwards. And we've implemented that in our Korean art gallery in the Asian wing. So I know that we're testing, our registrars are testing in there if things, I think we've got the same strips in there, also testing how does that impact the light exposure. And then that's something that we could also implement, say, in this part of the gallery, where these lights overhead maybe would shut off until someone walks in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think these are LEDs, but I'm not one of the lighting experts here. Oh, it was just a convenient place to put it where it wouldn't have to be on top of a frame of a painting or And actually, we've got information here. If people are wondering, what is that doing in there? Here it does explain. Is it art? No, but it helps protect the art. So an explanation of, so just convenience. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Right. Oh, that's a complicated, I don't have the answer for you because we have conservators who we consult with, and our registrars do a lot of that research for us, and they advise us as curators. So I actually don't know how those strips relate to the different um, mediums, like you said, watercolor versus crayon. But also it's the support that is the most susceptible. The paper can yellow. But I don't know. Eric, do you have any information on how, say, a watercolor would respond versus a crayon drawing? Yeah. We defer to the registrars. They're doing all the research for us. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. I'm going to ask because I need to know the answer to that question next time I get asked. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.